Divorced, beheaded and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Hey there, history enthusiasts! I'm the one with the glasses, which means I'm smart, and you should listen to me tell you about stuff. Today we're going to be talking about Henry VIII's wives, because that's really the only interesting thing about him. Yep, rather than being known for his maritime achievement in creating the Royal Navy or establishing the Royal College of Physicians, he's more famously remembered for his numerous divorces and the many dead wives he left in his wake. And also pretty much splitting his country in half for a side chick and absolving the Pope's religious authority in England. And he was also fat. Really, really fat. Now on to the wives. Divorced. Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. That lineage made her a super royal. So super royal, in fact, that technically Catherine had a stronger legitimate claim to the English throne than Henry did. But don't tell Henry that. He has an inferiority complex. Originally, Catherine was engaged to Henry's older brother Arthur, who at the time was the heir apparent to the throne. Catherine and Arthur got on quite well and married a mere 10 days after their first meeting. Unfortunately, only a few months into their marriage, Arthur tragically died of the sweating sickness, leaving Catherine a widow at the tender age of 16. Arthur's death left Catherine in a rather precarious state. The king, Henry VII, was none too eager to return Catherine's dowry, which he was obligated to do, should he send her back to Spain. He even initially considered marrying her himself to avoid the matter entirely. It was a different time, but still, gross! However, being married to an older man was the fate of a far less lucky Catherine. Catherine was instead promised to Henry VII's second son, Henry, Duke of York, who was 5 years younger than she was. It was decided that the wedding would take place when Henry came of age. Until then, Catherine was held as a virtual prisoner at Durham House in London. After 7 years of waiting, Catherine and Henry were wed in a private ceremony on June 11th, 1509. Catherine was an incredibly popular queen, known for her piety, charity, and support for the education of women. She was also a badass. One of her greater known feats happened during the war with Scotland. Catherine, despite being heavily pregnant at the time, rode north in full armour to address the troops. She would later send a letter to Henry, along with a piece of the bloodied coat of King James IV of Scotland, who died in the battle, for Henry to use as a banner. During her younger years, Catherine was also celebrated as the most beautiful creature in the world, with observers noting that she possessed every attribute the most beautiful girl could have. It was said by many that when it came to her looks, there were scarcely any women who could rival Queen Catherine at her peak. Catherine and Henry's marriage lasted for nearly 24 years, which was considered relatively happy and harmonious. However, the marriage was plagued by personal tragedies, including several stillbirths, miscarriages, and the death of infants. Only one of their children, Mary, who would later become Queen Mary I of England, survived to adulthood. The turning point in Catherine's life came when Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty, sought to annul their marriage. He questioned the validity of their union, arguing that according to Leviticus 20:21, their marriage was cursed because Catherine had been his brother's widow. Catherine argued that her marriage to Arthur had been unconsummated, so the marriage was not legitimate, but Henry refused to be swayed. He sought the help of the Pope to annul his marriage. But the Pope said nope. The Pope's refusal to annul the marriage led Henry to break away from the Roman Catholic Church, which began the English Reformation. This religious and political upheaval resulted in the establishment of the Church of England, with the king as its supreme head. In 1533, Henry married the vivacious Anne Boleyn, and Catherine was demoted from Queen to Dowager Princess of Wales, a title reflecting her status as Arthur's widow rather than Henry's wife. She spent her final years isolated from the royal court and separated from her daughter Mary. As her time drew near, Catherine wrote one final letter to Henry. In it, she forgave him all his past transgressions and begged him to be good to their daughter. In perhaps one final showing of the deep love she still held for Henry, she wrote, "Mine eyes desire you above all things." Catherine passed away at Kimbolton Castle on January 7, 1536. She was buried in Peterborough Cathedral, laid to rest as a princess, not a queen. Henry did not even bother to attend her funeral, and in a cruel move in line with his character, forbade poor Mary from attending. Until the day she took her final breath, Catherine referred to herself as Henry's only lawful wedded wife, and England's only rightful queen. Beheaded, Anne Boleyn, perhaps the most famous of Henry's wives. Anne was a pivotal figure in England's history. Born into the Boleyn family around 1501, Anne was no ordinary English lass. She spent her early years soaking up the culture of the Netherlands and France, which was pretty avant-garde for English women at the time. This experience and attitude gave her an edge, making her quite the catch when she returned to England. While not a great beauty like Catherine or her sister Mary, Anne was witty, clever and willful, more akin to a French native, commenters would say. This attitude won her many admirers and many more enemies. In the early 1520s, Anne returned to England and entered the court of King Henry VIII, where she served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. She soon caught the eye of King Henry, who had already had a past rendezvous with her sister, Mary Boleyn. Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, but he found himself enamoured by Anne's coquettish charm. Desperate for a male heir, which Catherine hadn't provided, Henry began to pursue Anne in earnest. Anne, however, wasn't about to become just another mistress. At the time, tensions were rising between Henry and Catherine, with Henry already looking to annul his marriage to secure a male heir. Prompted by the counsel of her father, Thomas Boleyn, she initially rebuffed the king's advances, holding out for the ultimate prize, marriage and the crown. Henry, desperate for a son and smitten with Anne, decided to upend the very foundation of the entire English religious institution just to marry her. Anne and Henry were married in a secret ceremony in 1533, after which she was crowned queen consort. The following year, Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, who would become the future Queen Elizabeth I. At first, her arrival was eagerly anticipated, with the expectation that she would be a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty's succession. The disappointment that she was not a boy did not diminish Anne's joy at her daughter's birth, but it had profound implications for Anne's standing with Henry and her safety at court. Anne, as queen, had a strong personality, a sharp wit, and the ability to speak her mind, traits possibly honed during her time at the French court. All traits desirable in a mistress, but much less appreciated in a queen. Her attitude didn't sit well with everyone. Anne's ascent to the throne was already controversial, particularly among those loyal to the still beloved Queen Catherine. Her reputation worsened after Anne officially married Henry, and people witnessed Queen Catherine and Princess Mary being demoted, neglected, and disrespected. Many directed their discontent towards Anne, finding it safer than pointing fingers at the king. Still, Anne made several important contributions during her time as queen. Anne was a known advocate for religious reform. She was personally interested in the new religious ideas circulating in Europe, particularly those associated with the Protestant Reformation. Anne used her position and influence to extend patronage to reformers and scholars. She was known to have a circle of reform-minded courtiers and intellectuals. One of Anne's most tangible contributions to the Reformation was her support for the translation and distribution of the Bible in English. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne suffered multiple miscarriages, a series of personal tragedies that also had significant political ramifications. The most well-documented of these occurred in January 1536, when Anne miscarried a male fetus. Henry soon began to look for ways to end his marriage to Anne. In April 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London on charges of adultery, incest, with her brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, and high treason. The evidence against her was flimsy and largely based on court gossip and the testimonies of tortured or coerced witnesses. Despite her eloquent defense, she was found guilty by a jury that included her own uncle and other men loyal to Henry. Anne's final speech before her execution was a testament to her dignity and grace in the face of injustice. While she did not explicitly declare her innocence in this speech, she subtly refuted the charges against her by commending her soul to God and asking for mercy for her accusers. She avoided direct criticism of the king, perhaps in an effort to protect her daughter, Elizabeth, and to avoid further retribution against her family and supporters. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed by beheading at the Tower of London. Her execution was carried out by a skilled French swordsman brought over from Calais as a final act of mercy by Henry. She was buried in an unmarked grave, where she remained undiscovered until 1876. Died Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was born around 1508 to Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth, a family of gentry with connections to the royal court. She was not as highly educated as Henry's previous wives, but she received a good upbringing that focused on household management and the skills considered appropriate for women of her class, such as needlework and religious devotion. Jane came to the Tudor court in the late 1520s or early 1530s, initially serving Queen Catherine of Aragon as a lady-in-waiting. After Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, Jane continued her service at court as a lady-in-waiting to the new queen. The first report of Henry's interest in Jane was in February 1536, about 3 months before Anne's execution. They were betrothed the day after Anne's execution and officially married 11 days after. Poor Anne. That had to sting. Described as of middle stature and no great beauty, Jane was a quiet, conservative queen. Jane's reputation at the Tudor court and among contemporary observers was markedly different from that of Anne. Her widely known compassion for the late Queen Catherine and her daughter Mary endeared her to the common folk and earned the admiration of many courtiers. Known for her gentle and peaceful demeanour, Jane was widely praised by those around her, earning accolades for her kindness and her efforts to foster peace at court. A stark contrast to the tumultuous atmosphere that had prevailed during Anne's tenure as queen. She also made sure to not dabble in national affairs, especially after a harsh reminder from Henry as to what happened to her predecessor. She was the picture of a demure and dutiful wife. Jane, upon becoming queen, played a crucial role in mending the relationship between Mary and Henry. Jane's efforts were instrumental in the eventual Parliamentary Act that restored both Mary and her half-sister Elizabeth to the line of succession, though they were still considered illegitimate. Mary herself seems to have held Jane in high regard, perhaps seeing her as a maternal figure or ally at court. Jane's pregnancy was announced in early 1537, and it was met with widespread rejoicing across the kingdom. The news of Jane's pregnancy led to grand public celebrations and preparations for the expected heir. Henry, cautious and wanting to ensure the best care for Jane and their unborn child, ordered renovations and improvements at Hampton Court Palace, where the birth was planned to take place. On October 12, 1537, Jane fulfilled her duty by giving birth to Edward, the future King Edward VI. Finally, Henry had the male heir he so desperately wanted. Unfortunately, Jane's health began to decline shortly after Edward's birth. Jane died on October 24, 1537, just 12 days after giving birth to Edward. Jane's death plunged the court into mourning and left Henry devastated. Henry's genuine grief at her death was evident, and he honoured her memory in the years that followed, often referring to her as his most beloved wife. Jane was the only one of Henry's wives to receive a queen's funeral. Henry even chose to be buried alongside Jane, a fitting tribute for the wife who granted his most desperate wish. Divorced, Anne of Cleves. Anne was born on September 22, 1515, in Düsseldorf to John III, Duke of Cleves, and Maria of Jülichberg. As a member of the German nobility, Anne received an education typical for a woman of her status at the time, which focused on domestic skills and piety rather than academic subjects or courtly manners. The marriage between Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII was orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who saw it as a means to secure a Protestant alliance against the Catholic powers of France and the Holy Roman Empire. After negotiations and the exchange of portraits, including the famous painting of Anne by Hans Holbein the Younger, the marriage treaty was signed in October 1539. Henry, known for his impulsive nature, decided to surprise Anne by visiting her incognito before the formal introduction. This was a tradition of courtly love and chivalry, where the king would test the bride's virtue and character. Henry travelled to Rochester, where Anne was staying, and entered her chambers disguised as a servant. The plan was for Henry to reveal his identity amidst a playful and romantic setting, expecting Anne to be charmed by his gesture. However, the encounter did not go as Henry had anticipated. Anne, who was unfamiliar with English customs and possibly with Henry's appearance, did not recognize the king. Henry's disappointment was profound, and his ego was bruised. No one had ever made him confront the fact that he was not the same handsome lad he was in his youth. He reportedly said to Thomas Cromwell, "I like her not! I like her not!" upon leaving Anne. The king felt deceived by the portrait he had been shown, claiming it had flattered Anne excessively. This unfortunate beginning cast a shadow over their marriage, which proceeded out of political necessity but was never consummated. Henry's disillusionment with Anne, combined with his growing dissatisfaction with Cromwell's political advice, led to a rapid decline in Cromwell's influence. After 6 months of marriage, Henry decided he was ready to swap out wives once more. Henry and Anne's marriage was annulled on July 9, 1540, primarily because Henry did not find her attractive and claimed that the marriage had never been consummated because of this. As if he had any room to talk. In reality, Anne was unfairly labelled the ugly wife, more due to Henry VIII's bruised ego than her actual appearance. Descriptions from her contemporaries paint a different picture. The French ambassador Charles de Marillac saw her as tall, slim, and moderately beautiful with a composed demeanour, while chronicler Edward Hall admired her fair long hair and her stylish attire, describing her overall appearance as comely. Cromwell was put on trial for his involvement in the Union and was executed for treason and heresy. Later, Henry would express remorse over the execution of his chief minister, and his rule never truly recovered from the debacle. Henry and Anne developed a friendly relationship after the annulment. She was considered an honorary member of the royal family and affectionately called the king's beloved sister. Frequently invited to court, Anne was granted special status by Henry as a token of appreciation for not disputing their annulment. He decreed that she would hold precedence over all women in England except for his wife and daughters. The settlement Anne received was substantial. She was granted several properties, including Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn's family, and Richmond Palace. These estates not only secured her financial independence, but also allowed her to maintain a courtly lifestyle, hosting her own guests and living largely as she pleased. Her relationship with Henry remained amicable, a rare occurrence given his history with his ex-wives. This relationship allowed her access to the royal children, with whom she developed a fond relationship, particularly with Princess Mary. She would later ride with Elizabeth directly behind Mary upon her entry to London for her coronation. Anne died at Chelsea Old Manor on the 16th of July 1557. Queen Mary ensured that she was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. Contrary to her title in the famous poem, Anne was the last of Henry VIII's wives to die, outliving both Henry and his final wife, Catherine Parr. Beheaded Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was born around 1523 to Lord Edmund Howard and Joyce Culpeper. Catherine was closely related to two of Henry's previous wives through her family ties. She was the first cousin of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, through her father. Additionally, she was the second cousin of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, through their shared grandmothers. Catherine's father was not wealthy and struggled with the responsibilities and expectations of his status. After the death of Catherine's mother, her father's financial difficulties deepened. Catherine was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk in Lambeth. This household was intended to be a place where young aristocratic women could be educated and prepared for court life and advantageous marriages. However, the Dowager Duchess's supervision was lax, allowing Catherine and the other young women under her care considerable freedom. The young women, including Catherine, were often left to their own devices. It was here that Catherine, barely a teenager, engaged in romantic and sexual liaisons with young men who were also part of or connected to the household. These relationships were poorly kept secrets that would later haunt Catherine. Two significant relationships during this period were with Henry Manox, a music teacher, and Francis Derham, a secretary in the Duchess's household. Catherine caught the eye of Henry VIII when she was a lady-in-waiting to his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. Henry was quickly enamoured with the young Catherine and fiercely began to court her as he worked to annul his marriage to Anne. Henry married Catherine Howard on July 28, 1540, just 19 days after his annulment from Anne of Cleves was finalised. Henry, who was about 49 years old at the time, saw in the much younger Catherine, who was likely around 16 or 17 years old, an embodiment of youth and a chance for new beginnings. Cool motive, still gross. The king showered Catherine with gifts, lands, and titles. However, Catherine's past and her present soon caught up with her. In late 1541, allegations about her premarital relationships emerged. It was revealed that she had engaged in a sexual relationship with Francis Derham during her adolescence. Under intense interrogation, Derham confessed to the relationship. Furthermore, rumours of her ongoing affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, began to circulate. This relationship, unlike her earlier liaisons, occurred while she was queen. When Henry was first informed of the possible pre-contract, he reportedly refused to believe it. He was deeply infatuated with Catherine and had viewed their marriage as a rejuvenating force in his life. The initial news was so disturbing to him that he demanded more concrete evidence before he would entertain the accusations fully. As more evidence was gathered and presented to Henry, including confessions and witness testimonies that corroborated the allegations, his denial turned to despair and rage. He reportedly broke down in tears. "Not so fun when you're on the receiving end, huh, Henry?" Catherine was arrested and confined at Sion Abbey and stripped of her title as queen. Legend has it that Catherine, upon learning of her impending doom and the loss of King Henry's favour, made a frantic attempt to reach him personally. This event is often dramatised in historical accounts and portrays Catherine escaping from her guards and running through the corridors of Hampton Court Palace. However, Catherine was intercepted and restrained before she could reach the king. Catherine's final days were marked by despair and isolation. It was reported that on the night before her execution, she requested the executioner's block be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head upon it. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London. She was beheaded with a single stroke, and her last words reportedly included prayers and expressions of penitence. There is a popular legend surrounding Catherine Howard's last words, suggesting that she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." However, this dramatic statement is not supported by any contemporary eyewitness accounts. Catherine Howard's body was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London, the same place where Anne Boleyn was buried. Survived, Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr was born around 1512 in Kendal, Westmoreland, to Sir Thomas Parr, a loyal servant and friend of Henry VIII, and Maud Green, a lady-in-waiting and close friend to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine's education was unusually comprehensive for a woman of her time. It included a strong foundation in religion, but also extended into areas typically reserved for men, including literature, languages, and philosophy. She was proficient in French, Latin, and possibly Italian. Before marrying Henry, Catherine was twice widowed. Her first marriage was to Edward Berg, a minor nobleman, in 1529. Details about Catherine's life during her marriage to Edward Berg are sparse. Edward was reported to have been in feeble health shortly after their marriage. After Edward's early death in 1533, she married John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, in 1534. During her marriage to Neville, she was held hostage during the Pilgrimage of Grace, a popular uprising against Henry VIII's religious reforms. Leveraging her late mother's connection with Catherine of Aragon, Catherine Parr rekindled her friendship with Lady Mary, joining her household. It was there that she caught King Henry VIII's eye. Catherine Parr married Henry VIII on July 12, 1543, at Hampton Court Palace, becoming the first Queen of England to also hold the title Queen of Ireland after Henry was declared King of Ireland. Before her marriage to Henry, Catherine had formed a romantic attachment to Sir Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour. However, when the king proposed, it was politically impossible for Catherine to decline, as a marriage to the king took precedence over personal romantic inclinations. As queen consort, Catherine Parr showed great acumen. She acted as an intermediary between the king and his court, and was influential in the lives of Henry's 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Catherine was particularly important in the restoration of Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, ensuring their places after their brother, Edward. Catherine's own religious beliefs leaned towards Protestantism, but she was moderate and cautious in her approach, mindful of Henry's strong opposition to radical reforms. She was also an advocate for religious education and reform, and worked to promote the publication of the first English Bible accessible to the public. Catherine was highly intellectual and used her position to foster a court culture of learning and piety. She wrote and published books, which was unprecedented for a queen consort of England. Her works included Prayers or Meditations, which became the first book published by an English queen under her own name, and The Lamentation of a Sinner, which outlined her Protestant beliefs. During their marriage, Henry's health was declining, and Catherine devoted herself to his care. Her care extended to managing his various ailments and providing comfort during his frequent bouts of ill health. Catherine shared a deep intellectual and religious connection with Henry. She was highly educated and engaged in theological discussions with him. Catherine's religious beliefs and her influence over Henry made her the target of conservative factions at court. At one point in 1546, her enemies, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Wriothesley, attempted to arrest her for heresy. However, Catherine managed to reconcile with Henry before the arrest could be carried out. Henry VIII died in 1547, leaving Catherine a widow once again. She quickly married Thomas Seymour, fulfilling her earlier romantic interest. Unfortunately, this marriage was fraught with complications and scandals, including allegations of inappropriate relations between Seymour and the young Elizabeth, who was living in their household. Catherine died in September 1548 due to complications from childbirth after giving birth to her only child, a daughter named Mary Seymour. Her death left her daughter, Mary Seymour, motherless, and Thomas Seymour's subsequent execution for treason in 1549 left Mary an orphan. Mary Seymour disappears from the historical record after 1550. Catherine Parr was buried at St Mary's Chapel, located within Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, England. She is the only English queen to be buried on private property. She survived Henry by a mere year and 8 months. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to see more videos from me, make sure to like and subscribe. See you all next time.